So guys, let's start another wonderful manhwa. Seoul, capital of South Korea, year 2021. We have a beautiful day, very sunny, and we can see 5 students in an alley. But to be more specific, it's 4 people against 1. And we see a studious boy holding his notepad, telling the bully, his classmate, to say what he wants because he doesn't want to be late for class. And with an air of superiority, he doesn't even look at the bully's face, and already quite irritated with his face, the nervous guy says, "What's up, Jamin?" Jamin is the name of the face who is holding a notepad, and we're going to call him Jamin. Jamin tells the bully that if he has nothing to say, he's leaving. And all of the bully's friends start laughing at his face, saying that the bully with the quiff was completely ignored. After being teased a lot by his colleagues, he becomes very angry and shouts at Jamin, calling him a piece of shit, telling him to stop right now, cursing Jamin like a good mother's son. The guy prepares a punch and runs into Jamin's back. Jamin, looking like a protagonist, closes his notebook without looking back and kicks Richard in the head, causing him to lose his balance and fall, without noticing the license plate of the truck that hit him. Richard is on the floor, fighting with his body not to be turned off. Does it happen with that kick that it goes out, or doesn't it go out? I would have deleted it. Jamin, with the air of a protagonist, looks superiorly over Richard, but Richard is good at fighting, and he didn't even faint, and he gets up cursing Jamin. Jamin, with disdain, knows that he will beat Richard in that dispute. Jamin says he doesn't care if Richard wants to be a bully, just don't mess with him. And Jamin completes the warning, saying that his life is already difficult enough without the presence of the bully. The bully, still on the ground, looks Jamin straight in the face and tells him not to pretend to be so strong, and says that from now on, he is really fucked. And Jamin, with his hand on his hip, looks at him with a disdainful face and says, "Really?" But Jamin is very naive, as you can see, and forgot that there are other people in the fight, and he gets hit so hard in the back of the head that it feels like his soul is going to leave his body. And the guy with a baseball bat laughs at Jamin's face and asks if Jamin thought they were there just for decoration. Jamin, after that, starts sweating drops of ketchup, or ketchup is coming out of his nose. At that time, the bully starts to smile, as Jamin is at his feet, and he asks if the blow Jamin took hurt. The bully says he bets that the hit Jamin took hurt a lot, and says that Jamin only got hit because he shows off at school, and that, from now on, he will show Jamin's place at school. Jamin, very angry, tells him, "Fuck you." Richard looks straight into Jamin's face and says, "Do you bastard want to keep getting beaten?" Richard, with a smile on his face, says he wants to see how long Jamin can last, and tells his friends to finish off Jamin. I honestly don't know how Richard's friends are going to end up with Jamin, because they don't have eyes or they wanted to save on paint. And a beautiful spanking session begins. Suddenly, Richard sees a light in front of him, but he thinks he is imagining things. When, suddenly, several glowing orbs begin to appear near Richard, and he is left wondering what that could be. Richard looks around and sees that more white spheres are appearing. Meanwhile, the free massage session continues to happen. The masseuses are not noticing what is happening. However, Richard sees that something is wrong, because there are many bright lights, and they are shining so much, to the point that Richard puts his hand in front of his face to not see that light. Suddenly they stop, because one saw something flash, another saw nothing, and another asks Richard what that was. Richard responds by saying he doesn't know anything. The only thing he saw was a flash, and it scared him quite a bit. Falling to the ground, Jamin continues with a fierce look. However, Richard thinks he's still cool and wants to continue the massage session. Stepping affectionately on Jamin's head, Richard tells Jamin to stay on the floor. And only after that did Richard have a happy face. Suddenly, a stranger appears next to Richard saying, "Interesting, it's been 20 years and nothing has changed here." Richard is shocked by a stranger who appears out of nowhere next to him. And the stranger starts to analyze Richard, saying that the uniforms haven't changed at all. Richard, not understanding anything, asks, "Who are you, bum?" And the stranger asks, "Tramp? What do you mean?" The stranger, who appeared out of nowhere, continues talking. "Is this how phlegmy little brats like you talk to your seniors?" Jamin starts looking at that whole scene without understanding what is happening. The stranger, who appeared out of nowhere, is now less angry and says that they just had a lapse, so he will forgive what they just said. But Richard says to the stranger who appeared out of nowhere, "And who cares that you're our veteran?" Richard, trying to intimidate the stranger who appeared, tells him to take care of himself and continues walking. And he doesn't know why a bum is getting involved in this matter. Richard asks the stranger, who appeared out of nowhere, if he's trying to get beaten up by the freshman. Richard tells the stranger who appeared out of nowhere to get lost, otherwise he will show him where he belongs. Suddenly, The stranger who appeared out of nowhere asks if all kids these days are like him, without education. And the stranger says more. He says that they shouldn't be talking to a veteran like that. Richard at the same time says he's full of shit and tells him to leave before he kills him. After that, Richard punches the stranger who appeared out of nowhere in the chest. However, the punch had no effect, and Richard's hand remains still on the stranger's chest. This makes the stranger who appeared out of nowhere very angry, and he grabs Richard's arm and says that if he keeps being an asshole, he's going to break his arm. Richard frees himself from the stranger's hands and asks if he has lost his mind. The stranger who appeared out of nowhere is our protagonist, Jamin. He's just a punching bag, not the protagonist. And with great brutality, Richard advances on the stranger, saying he's going to beat him up and leave him all blue. Richard throws a direct punch at the stranger, but the stranger is very strong and very good at fighting and dodging without any difficulty. Richard doesn't understand how he ended up in a vacuum like that, and the stranger tells Richard that he should have stopped while he was taking it easy, and also tells Richard that he should treat his veteran as if he were a god. Richard, look at that! You must be thinking this stranger has something wrong with his head. Then, the stranger looks at Richard and says that he must be the type who only learns from scratch. Then, the stranger makes a gesture with his hands and starts speaking a language that the others don't understand. Everyone watches the crazy protagonist raising his hands and making strange gestures with his fingers. After that, the stranger keeps snapping his fingers. Snap your fingers from one side to the other, and nothing happened. And everyone is wondering what this crazy person is doing. The stranger, who has not yet spoken his name, looks at his hand and says that the spell is not working. And Richard exclaims, "Oh, really? It didn't work? Why is everything so ridiculous these days, huh?" Richard tells the stranger not to act like he's anything in this life, since he's just a piece of shit. And the stranger is there, snapping his finger one way, snapping his finger the other, in a complete vacuum. And of course, everyone was already thinking he was retarded. A huge retard. The stranger stopped snapping his fingers, looked to the side, saw that there was no point in using magic, and that those students were calling him retarded. So, the stranger says he has no choice. Since he doesn't have magic, he goes for a physical attack. This way, the stranger prepares a supreme flick. Richard was wondering what this crazy person was up to, when suddenly, he took a huge flick and flew away like shit. Richard flies several meters and crashes into the concrete, breaking the concrete with his body. Jamin, who is useless, is left open-mouthed, as are the extras, Richard's helpers. After a supreme shake, Richard went to sleep happily. And the stranger, with his fingers smoking and with a smile on his face, prepares the new supreme flick and asks, who will be next? Jamin is shaking at what he saw. A while later, we are shown that the supreme flick was also distributed to the others, and with that, all the other 3 extras were passed out on the floor. Richard continues to sleep, and Jamin is very surprised by the stranger's strength, as he finished off all 4 of them with a single finger. And the stranger is all smiles, because he taught these idiots a painful lesson. And Jamin, who has never seen such a crazy person, wonders who this strange, crazy person is. But humbly, Jamin thanks him for his help, and our protagonist says it was nothing. After everything calms down, the stranger begins to analyze Jamin. And Jamin, like any good punching bag, says it's okay, his head is very resistant. And the stranger says, that's not it, that he doesn't care about Jamin's head. The stranger says he wants to know what today's date is, and Jamin is surprised by the question. And the stranger asks again, what is today's date? Jamin says that today is September 10 o'clock. And the stranger insists and asks, what year? From 2021, of course. Upon hearing this answer, the protagonist is very amazed and tells Jamin that he was summoned in 2016, so it should be around 2036, since I was there for 20 years. The stranger, without knowing what happened, does the math, as it has only been 5 years here on Earth, and he lived 20 years on the planet of Alphen. The protagonist exclaims, it's better this way, and Jamin doesn't understand why he said that. The stranger says goodbye to Jamin, saying, told you, I'm gone, I'm leaving, bye. The stranger gives Jamin a warning, tells him not to be beaten from now on. Jamin, seeing the stranger leaving, wonders, what the hell is he? And the stranger is there, snapping his fingers and trying to leave that place. Jamin, seeing that, asks himself, what is he doing now? The stranger, in addition to snapping his fingers, now keeps saying, teleport, teleport, but no teleporting. Jamin, looking at that, tells himself that this stranger looks more like a crazy person than a repeating student. Suddenly, the stranger stops snapping his fingers and looks at Jamin. Jamin gets goosebumps. Jamin keeps thinking, why is the stranger coming back? That person is very strange and is approaching me again. Arriving close to Jamin, the stranger asks what his name is, and Jamin introduces himself. I'm Du Jamin. You can call me Jamin. Then, the protagonist says, Hey Jamin, since I saved you, could you lend me some money? And Jamin can't believe what he just heard. The strange student says that he came back too soon and he can't materialize any magic in that place. Jamin thinks he got it wrong, because he just got involved with a very strange animal. At this time, the protagonist begins to tell his story. He says he was in a very different world and had just been teleported back to Earth. And the stranger continues with his explanation, saying that he had some kind of problem with the mana handling system during the process of returning to Earth. And he concludes that if the process had worked, he would have been teleported to the front of his house. The stranger explains that he cannot cast any magic in that place. Jamin, very smart, sends the message and asks, how much money does he need? And protagonist says he needs 2,001. Jamin was stupid. He only had a 5,000 bill, and the stranger took the 5,000 bill, and also, he took Jamin's phone number. The stranger thinks about how cool Jamin is and assures him that he will pay back what he owes, as he even took the phone number to return the money. The protagonist looks at his reflection in the glass and realizes that it has only been 5 years here on Earth. And he thinks this is good because not much time has passed, and he hopes his family recognizes him. Doing those Math King maths, he realizes that he is 24 years old, but his parents are probably around 50 years old. And Sua, her little sister, must be about 7 years old now. The scene changes to a subway station. As he approaches the station, the stranger sees many soldiers and wonders if an accident has happened inside the subway station. As he is unable to reach any conclusion, the protagonist sees 2 students passing by and decides to ask them some questions. He asks what the soldiers are doing in front of the metro station. Did something happen there? The girls, not understanding the question, look at each other in amazement and, laughing at the stranger, they respond that it is normal for soldiers to be protecting the entrance to the dungeon and ask if he was in a coma all this time. The stranger, with a pastel face, doesn't understand the answer and wonders what they are talking about. The stranger realizes he can't take the subway and intends to take a taxi. However, walking another block, he sees another subway station where there are no soldiers in front. So he decides to get off at the subway station, wearing his very chic women's boots. And I think these boots are feminine. The stranger finds the subway station locked with a padlock and doesn't understand what is happening. As it is daytime, the subway station should be open. And this leads the protagonist to become more suspicious, as he thinks there has been an accident inside the subway station. However, by coincidence of the script, or power of the protagonist, the key to the subway entrance is right next door. And of course, the protagonist wasn't going to let this one go, right? Either the key appeared out of nowhere next to the protagonist, or someone ran to the bathroom and left the key there. Feminine-style boots. And we head into the subway station. The stranger notices that the subway is completely empty. There is no one working. The protagonist observes that they closed the entire subway station. The stranger thinks he shouldn't have entered, and tries to leave the subway station, and receives an alert that he has entered a dungeon. Suddenly, the protagonist's eyes widen as a system panel appears in front of him. The stranger, very curious, wonders what that must be, and remembers the girls when they said that it is normal for soldiers to be at the entrance of the dungeon to protect it. Only now did he realize that he had entered a dungeon, and the protagonist receives another announcement from the system saying that this dungeon has already been completed, so basic monsters will be summoned. And he's wondering, monsters on the subway? What happened to Earth in the last 5 years? Then, the stranger tries to return, but the dungeon is already blocked. There are only 2 ways to leave the dungeon, with a special dungeon exit stone, and with a return stone at the end of it. After touching the gate, the protagonist receives a message from the system, saying that he does not have any return stone. So, he understands that he made a big mistake, and knows that if he wants to get out of there, he will have to clear that entire dungeon to find the return stone. So, since there's no other way, the protagonist looks inside the dungeon and, let's go, right? The stranger looks into the dark and thinks it's his imagination, but it seems like the monsters are going to appear out of nowhere. Claws begin to come towards the protagonist, and he soon realizes that something is coming towards him. Suddenly, a wolf dog appears, a very ferocious thing coming to hunt him. The stranger, out of pure instinct, avoids. However, that big-eared wolf keeps growling at him. The protagonist tries to use restriction magic, but it fails. And the big-eared dog, taking advantage of this, makes a fierce jump at the protagonist. The protagonist seems like he hasn't learned. Even without magic, he tries to cast another spell and is forced to dodge again. Only then does the protagonist, standing in front of the big-eared dog, decide to examine the animal properly and is amazed. The protagonist, whose name we still don't know, is looking more closely at the monster and recognizes the long-eared dog as a Drebet. Drebet, full of fury, jumps on the stranger for the third time. Meanwhile, the strange protagonist is left wondering, why is a creature that should be on Alphen here on Earth? Suddenly, the protagonist looks to the side and, miraculously, there is a brand new crowbar there, just waiting for him. Dodging Drebet's attack once again, he grabs his crowbar. Now yes, the mess has gone crazy. The protagonist is armed with a crowbar against the big-eared dog, and he only thinks about one thing, killing that damn big-eared dog. And the dog, thirsty for blood, takes another leap at the protagonist once again. Only this time, the stranger is armed, and with his crowbar, he pierces Drebet's skull. The stranger looks very satisfied, splashed with the Drebet's blood. The protagonist says he can't materialize magic, but a Drebet is nothing to him. But it doesn't end there. New paws emerge from the shadow, and the stranger quickly turns to see who is coming. Then once again prepare for combat. Only this time, it's not one Drebet but four. But for the protagonist, this is just fun, as the Drebet are not at all threatening. The protagonist thinks, if it's just Drebet, I can deal with him very easily. Now, if a stronger monster appears, then things could change a little. After killing the last of the four Drebeti, the stranger leveled up, and he is very surprised by the news. And we are shown the protagonist's status window. Realizes that he has returned to level 1. The protagonist regressed from level 99 to level 1. However, his strength, dexterity, vitality, intelligence, everything remains as it was before. Your basic attributes have not been reset. And certainly, the protagonist will be much stronger than he was before his return. And now, as a beginner, the stranger knows he has a long climb ahead. And another thing, he realizes that his Necromancer skill has been maintained. Therefore, he brought his Necromancer skill to Earth. It's a small progress. You reach level 0, killed 5 puppies, and are now at level 1. The protagonist will take the opportunity to level up, as these monsters from the planet Alphen are walking around Seoul. The protagonist keeps looking at his status window, trying to guess what this transfer is in front of his Necromancer class. But I already told you what it is. He brought his Necromancer class from the planet Alphen. But something even more stolen happened. In exchange for going from level 99 to level 1, status points and skills were created. And the protagonist has accumulated 99 contribution points that he hasn't used yet. In other words, it's like those games where you are reborn and become stronger to level up again. Prota received a complete hack kit. He received transferred skills, a summon combo box, and finally, he received an achievement store. Since he doesn't know what that is, let's poke around to see what it is. And we are shown the combo box, which looks a lot like that combination from Minecraft. Afterwards, the protagonist opens the achievement store and sees that he has 5 achievement points. This store didn't exist for him in Alphen, and this online store is really cool. The protagonist begins to decide what his priorities are, and knows that getting skills is his highest priority. The protagonist knows, if he wants to find the return stone, he needs the quest skill. And to face the monsters, he needs the ability to detect and summon Skeleton Warrior. This is all enough. Each skill costs 10 points, and he only has 5 achievement points, so each animal he kills gives 1 achievement point. The way, then, is to kill everything that comes your way, and with that, collect points to buy these first skills. But first, the protagonist decides to distribute the points he has. Since he has 99 points, let's distribute them. The protagonist decides to distribute his points across basic survival stats, as he does not yet have a class. So, all 99 points were distributed. At the same time, he feels the drastic change in his body. And the protagonist is impressed with the strength he now has and takes several slices in the air. This crowbar will be very useful. The protagonist is eager to destroy the monsters with his crowbar. The stranger has a clear objective: to kill the monsters to get achievement points, and his first skill to be chosen is the search skill, because with it, he can find the return stone. So let's start killing Drebet to buy skills. With his stylish boots, a feminine model, the protagonist advances towards the Drebet. But the Drebet are also very bold and attack the protagonist. And of course, the protagonist will thank his Drebeti's friends for voluntarily coming to their deaths. Finishing his last draft, the protagonist feels a little tired, now rising to level 3. The protagonist thinks that these animals won't stop appearing, but he's fine killing them all, just a little tired. More than 20 Drebeti's are gone. So, he buys the search and detection skills and starts using them right away to try to find the return stone. The protagonist is disappointed, as there is no turning stone nearby. He knows that the only place left is the bottom floor of the subway. Looking down the stairs, he sees several pointy-eared puppies, and he knows he has to go down there if he wants to find the return stone. So, the protagonist knows he can't face them head-on alone, since there are so many of them. So, with a smiling face, our Necromancer decides to show what his true style is. And he buys the Summon Skeleton Soldier Skill Book. The protagonist can command up to 9 soldiers. To summon a skeleton soldier, he needs a body, so each Drabit body can become a skeleton soldier. And now, the designer forgot that he had put 10 points in mana and 9 in control, and decided to put 5 in each. After doing this, the protagonist looks at the bodies of the dead Drabit and uses the famous phrase of every summoner, "Arise." Nothing like a necromancer being a necromancer, so the protagonist starts to smile, because he knows that now it won't just be him, it will be him and 5 others. So, let's go on the first hunt with your skeleton soldiers. The protagonist orders the skeletons to advance, and he follows, using his skeletons as a shield. And Drabit falls right into the protagonist's trap and jumps on the first skeleton to destroy it. However, the skeletons are level 1 and have difficulty facing the Drabit. The protagonist observes how the Drabete find it easy to destroy their skeletons, but he only needs their skeletons to serve as a shield for him, because he will do the rest. The protagonist has faced these Drabit several times and knows that his first attack is the most lethal. So, after the Drabet's first attack, the protagonist uses the opening to easily kill 2 at once. And so, he uses these 2 bodies to summon 2 new skeletons. Therefore, he has 6 skeletons, one of which is one-armed. Look there. The one-armed man is back there. As the puppies don't think, they attack the skeletons. After that, the protagonist uses that already known tactic. He uses his skeletons to block the Drabet's first attack, then enters killing them all, and then summons more skeletons again. There's no way he can lose. Since this is very effective, he already has 9 skeletons. Now that he has killed all of the Drabet, he uses his ability to search for the return stone and locates it very close to him. The scene changes to the exit of this dungeon, and we see a guy returning from the bathroom. This is the guard who forgot the key for the protagonist to get. Nothing like a half-hour shit. The shitty extra observes that the lock on the dungeon door is open and becomes desperate, wondering what happened, and comes to the conclusion that a civilian entered the dungeon. And the shit knows it's going to be bad for him because he failed to fulfill his duty. He left the dungeon's door. The shit starts to call his superiors to ask for help, when suddenly, the dungeon's return portal starts to open, and the shit is scared by the protagonist coming out of the portal. Without knowing what is happening, the protagonist starts coming towards the shit. And the shitter asks if he's an awakened. The protagonist says he doesn't know what an awakened is. Tell the shit your name, open the gate, and leave. The scene changes to an alley, at the exit of another dungeon, and we see a person with a bag full of bloodstones. And he says that today's loot was very good, as he smuggled himself into a dungeon. This adventurer knows that he should register and then enter a dungeon, as the guilds that own dungeons charge very high fees. Therefore, he thinks he is very clever, as he enters the dungeon he wants without registering and then sells the bloodstones on the black market. And these bloodstones are worth 4 times their value on the black market. And this adventurer, whose name was not mentioned, says that only an idiot sells stones in the normal market. Suddenly, he hears a voice calling him a fucking rat. The person asks how much he stole doing this thing. It's a woman who talks to him, but she's in the dark and he can't see her. And he asks, "Who are you?" And a beautiful woman appears asking, "Do you want to know who I am?" A very beautiful redhead appears and says she is the Reaper who came to take him to his death. What a well done drawing, huh? That woman is the captain of the Scarlet Bird team, Lee Yvonne. I'll call her Yvonne to make it easier. Yvonne, beautiful and delicious, asks the adventurer how dare he steal stones from her guild. This adventurer recognizes Yvonne and says that he knows she is from the Varang Guild. The little thief says that Yvonne is a shrew who loves to kill. And Yvonne tells the thief, since he knows her, it's better to come without resisting and to come quietly. But a thief who is a thief always likes to run, right? So he prepares a spell to cast on Yvonne. He says he's not a fool to go without a fight, and throws several ice spikes towards her. Yvonne doesn't even lose her beauty and can dodge very easily. The thief, very cowardly, is already on the corner running away. But Yvonne is a monster of a woman and has hyperspeed, and she says to the little thief, "If you want to die, then die." And he passes the sword to the thief, cutting him. And Yvonne says to the dying man, "You should have come when I told you to come quietly. So, let's rescue the robbery." The beautiful Yvonne's cell phone rings, and the shit wants to know if the guild authorized anyone to enter there without registering. And the shit asks for personal confirmation. While our protagonist is at the bus stop, thinking about which bus number he needs to take to go home, Yvonne is also thinking about him, saying, who would be the rat who had the courage to invade her guild's dungeon? The scene changes, and we see the protagonist arriving by bus where his home would be. Still wearing his fancy women's boots, he walks to where his home was. In this path, he thinks whether it is dungeons or whether it is monsters. This is not the world he knew 5 years ago. What the hell happened to the world in the last 5 years when I wasn't here? And so, the protagonist walks towards his home and hopes that nothing wrong has happened to his family. When he arrives in front of his house, he gets a big shock because he knows he didn't miss the place. But where is your home? He stands, desperate, in front of a huge building. In 5 years, many things have happened. And he is surprised because they built a very large building in 5 years on the site where his house was. And he wonders if his family is somewhere else or if they are living there. The name of a company is written on that facade, so it's definitely an office building. The afternoon was already falling, and he was too tired to be able to meet his family that day. Suddenly, his stomach growls and he realizes he's been walking all day and hasn't eaten anything. So, he went to a fast food place, nice to go, and ate that ramen. You feel like eating hot ramen now, huh? And he devoured that ramen with gusto, because it had been 20 years since he had eaten ramen or anything that reminded him of Earth. After he ate the ramen and drank a Coca-Cola, then yes, he is sure he returned to Earth. The protagonist realizes he is almost out of money and says he doesn't want to go to a sauna and doesn't even have enough money for a motel. He looks at the change for the food and sees that he will have to camp in the subway. But suddenly, he remembers that he won't even be able to camp on the subway, as all the subway stations have become a dungeon. Suddenly, the power of protagonism acts again. Meanwhile, the protagonist is lamenting, saying that he doesn't even have money to buy dinner and that he only has enough for a cup of ramen. The scene changes to Jamin, and he keeps thinking about the protagonist asking for money and thinks there was something wrong with that stranger. After that, Jamin enters a cafeteria, which, by coincidence of fate, or by force of protagonism, is the same one where the protagonist is. Jamin, when he realizes that that crazy person is there, gets a shock. And the protagonist realizes that it's his lucky day, as his traveling bank has just arrived. Jamin, all trembling, thinks that he must have done something wrong to meet that stranger twice in the same day. Then, Jamin turns his back to leave. The protagonist quickly gets up and holds Jamin from behind and says that Jamin arrived at the perfect time, as he was about to call him, as he knows that his friend Jamin would never let him down. And Jamin, who isn't close to him at all, asks him what he wants from him. The protagonist asks, "Are your parents home?" And Jamin asks why he wants to know this. The protagonist says he needs to tell Jamin's parents that their son was being beaten by 4 people. Jamin says that his parents died. The protagonist, hearing that, says, "Ah, that's good." He doesn't even finish saying what a good thing it is, and he looks to the side, holding his head with a sad expression and says, "How sad." The protagonist, looking at Jamin, asks if he lives alone. So, without wanting to know the answer, he says, "Let's go." And Jamin, without understanding, asks, "Where to?" The protagonist, very disguised, says, "To his house, of course." The protagonist says he won't stay in the house for free and gives the last 3 coins to Jamin. Jamin looks at it in disbelief, not believing, and says to the protagonist, "Wait a minute, isn't that the money you took?" Jamin hadn't even finished saying "gotcha" when a fist passes by his side at high speed, and he is left in shock, static, stopped. Of course it was the protagonist, and he says he saw a fly, and shows the fly he caught on the side of Jamin's head. Jamin, pressured by the protagonist, sees no other way out and takes him to his home. The scene changes to the next day, to the school where the protagonist studied, and we see the scene of him talking to his old teacher. The professor, looking at the protagonist, is very surprised that he is alive, as everyone thought he had died. The protagonist, with a smile on his lips, says, "It's been a long time, Professor." The professor gets straight to the point and asks where and how he survived all this time. The professor says that when he disappeared, everyone thought he had died. And the protagonist says that, technically, he died and came back to life. The protagonist tells the teacher that he needs to sort out some things, so he asks if he can take a look at the students' records. The scene changes to room 3 on the 2nd floor, or room 2 on the 3rd floor, where we see Jamin, punching bag, talking to a beautiful girl. And Richard, who apparently studies in the same class as him, is right behind him, looking angry. Whoever hits forgets, and whoever gets hit doesn't forget. Richard, until now, has not forgotten the scratch he received, the supreme fingerprint. Richard arrives with complete ignorance and asks the beautiful girl who was talking to Jamin to get out of there, as he needs to talk to him. Giving Jamin a loving hug, Richard calls Jamin a little shit and says that he was very lucky yesterday because that random crazy person came out of nowhere and saved his ass, and says that they are going to finish that conversation from yesterday. And Jamin, like any dumb punching bag, wants to be beaten quietly without saying anything to anyone, and tell him not to make a fuss in the room, that he will meet Richard. At the same time, Richard gets very angry and says, "What do you mean? Don't make a fuss." Everyone in the room starts to hear Richard yelling at Jamin. Jamin, who has already lost all courage to fight, was caught by the hair by Richard, who says that he still doesn't realize the situation he is in, and that this time, he is going to break some of his ribs. When, suddenly, someone arrives at the door and tells him to stop right now. The protagonist says he arrived at a great time. Richard is very angry and full of courage. You notice that Richard doesn't know which truck hit him. The protagonist tells all the bullies to follow him. The bully came back because he just got slapped, and he doesn't even know what happened after that. Now, if the protagonist had destroyed both him and his will to fight, then he would never come back. The scene changes to the school terrace, and there are several extras just looking, although there are 2 extras there who can't look because they have no eyes. They're wondering why a lone stranger picked a fight with Richard's gang, and Jamin wonders what that person is doing here at school. Meanwhile, we see the hilarious scene of the protagonist dodging Richard's punches. And Richard, who has not yet come to his senses, calls the protagonist a rat and tells him to stop dodging his punch. And the protagonist keeps thinking that, whether on Alphen or on Earth, people like Richard will always exist. People who become arrogant due to their influence or power. And Richard is giving it his all, trying to hit the protagonist, who isn't even sweating. The protagonist knows that Richard acts like it's all about a fight, without really knowing his own place. And this reminds the protagonist of a stranger named Cassis, who was part of the Alphen Union. It was this masked guy, blonde, elf, and with nails that he never cuts. What a beauty that was, huh? Look at that nail! You know why he's not showing his other hand, right? Because he broke a nail, so he had to cut the other nails on that hand. Cassis nicknamed me the Necromancer of the massacre, because I was an immoral reaper of souls. But Cassis did one thing wrong. He coveted the protagonist's territory, and he did everything to unite the Union against the protagonist. Coming back from Deja Vu, we see Richard all sweaty and unable to land a single punch on the protagonist. And this protagonist is the way I like it, as he is not fearful and does not forgive his enemies. I will never bring you a work in which the protagonist is fearful. Richard yells to his gang, "Hey, you guys, how much longer are you going to stand there? Come and attack that bastard." And the protagonist says there's only one way to deal with people like that. Meanwhile, all 4 advance towards the protagonist. And how is the protagonist? Smiling on your face and wearing sandals that get in the way of the fight? Oh, subscribed. A tip for you. If you ever get into a fight, don't wear sandals like that, okay? Stay barefoot, because otherwise you'll lose. And so, the protagonist, who is almost Sundetsu, explains that you must return what people did to you 10 times worse, and with crushing force, no less. Then, it's face slap time, and the protagonist starts to dole out a lot of slaps. Richard is the first to receive his gift, and with interest. The protagonist is just not punching them, because he is very strong. If he punches them, they will certainly die. So, it's a slap in the face to humiliate. And we see that Richard's bully stands there shaking. The protagonist told Richard to come and fight, and not just stand there. Were you not wanting me to react? Richard gets very angry and prepares a big punch. So, from then on, it was just beatings. Sometime later, everyone is down and groaning, and the protagonist calling them trash, humiliating them even more. The protagonist says that they are weak, that they only know how to make a lot of noise while they are being beaten. Therefore, the protagonist tells them to moan softly. Suddenly, the protagonist's spider sense begins to vibrate, or it's pure script. A taxi stops in front of the school, and he is very surprised to see who got out of the taxi. And we are shown a middle-aged lady who, in a great hurry, goes towards the school. And the protagonist soon recognizes her and calls her mother. This is the most touching scene you can see in a manhwa. A mother who thought her son had died finds him alive after many years. The protagonist's mother melts into tears, and he's also very emotional, but he doesn't shed any tears. I think you'll need a psychologist. According to his mother's words, shortly after he disappeared 5 years ago, dungeon outbreaks took place around the world, in which all subway stations became dungeons at the same time. And she informs him that his father passed away after being caught in the middle of the dungeon outbreak. His father was coming home from work and was killed by a monster. Therefore, his mother had to live alone while taking care of Suwa. Suwa is the protagonist's little sister. And his mother continues her explanation, saying that their family didn't have much money, and after his younger sister fell ill, the finances they had in reserve quickly ran out. So, she had to sell the house and rent the small apartment to be able to pay for her sister's treatment. But, thank God, now your sister is very well. She is cured. After the day the dungeons broke out, every single day was just pain and suffering. After that, the protagonist's mother says she's going to daycare to pick up her younger sister and tells him not to go anywhere. If it were my son, I would take him to daycare. I don't even want to know. 5 years without seeing him, I would take him along. And the protagonist keeps observing where his mother lives. And we are shown the small apartment where his mother is living with his little sister. It's just that there, in the bathroom. The protagonist thinks that he can feel, just by looking, the difficulty his mother goes through being responsible for a family alone. This room was actually too small for the whole family to sleep in. And the protagonist looks at closed boxes on the wall, and there were many boxes, and they took up an entire wall. When he opens it to see what it is, there were many things of him and his late father.